The last 20, 25 years, we've all been used to internet auctions, eBay et al. Back in the 1960s, when I was about 19 years old, I started buying 78 RPM records. It allowed you to buy things that were made before you were born. I was born in 1949, 72 and a half years old now. But I had grown up playing guitar since 1964 and started off being impressed by the Beatles as well as other rock and roll acts. But by about 1968, I started listening to 1930s blues, Robert Johnson, 1940s Lightnin' Hopkins, and I got to be able to buy records by those guys. But back then, the auctions were written. You had to get a list of what was available, and it would tell you the condition. In text, it would tell you minimum price. And so I was able to buy Lightnin' Hopkins records for $1.50 when I was a senior in high school in 1967, 1966. I was working in a burger stand for $1.35 an hour, minimum wage. At that time, a Chevy station wagon would run $3,000. And so eventually I was able to bid on a couple Robert Johnson 78s Vocalion records made in 1936, 37. And I was pretty excited because I had the John Hammond produced Columbia LP that had sold about 25,000 copies at that time. And so I bid, I think minimum bid was $12 a piece, and I think I bid $18 and I didn't win them. Eventually I met Henry Vestine, lead guitar player for Canned Heat blues band, and so I used to be able to visit him in Pacific Palisades. And he said, I bid $24 on those things, that's why I won them. So minimum bid was $12, I bid $18, he got them for $24. And it was about 3 years later that the next opportunity to buy a Robert Johnson 78. So I bid about $31 at that time and I won it. You would bid on a record and you would mail the bid in, and 6 weeks later you'd find out if you had won. And it was a pretty exciting time because these were, we had all the Summer of Love stuff going on. And I remember buying Black Snake Moan by Blind Lemon Jefferson for about $30. At that time, I was working maybe 16 hours, a 2 8-hour shift to be able to buy one record. But it was very exciting because you could get records that weren't on LPs yet. At that time, you had Roots LPs out of Austria. Jazz and blues was very big in Europe at the time. And so I was able to buy Ramblin' Thomas hot slide guitar, Blind Willie Johnson great slide guitar. I was playing guitar slide myself at the time. I eventually taught some students how to do very well with it. I'd say, hey, mute with the back of your hand or else don't tell people you studied with me. You get a very clean sound by muting with a bottleneck. If you didn't, you got a very noisy sound. And so eventually I got to hang out with Henry Vestine in 1969. I got to meet him and Al Wilson at Henry's house in Pacific Palisades. If you remember the very first Canned Heat LP, they show them sitting around a table. Well, that room was in the small cottage in the back of Henry's main house in Pacific Palisades. Henry was quite a aficionado of the blues. He and Al Wilson had gone into the South and canvassed, as they called it, looking for records, and sometimes they would find a house with 20,078 RPM records as a foundation for the house, and that's why these things were so rare. Some of these things had 400 copies to be made initially. And if it took off, they would reprint them. It could become a big success. But Henry Vestine wisely took advantage of being able to buy these things. I got to see test pressings. He had a test pressing, it'd be a 10-inch record where it would have a white label and it would have the name of the song and the artist and the record number. And so when I got to bid in my second auction and get a Robert Johnson record, I got to stop breaking down. So I get the record, comes in the mail, I open it up, I stick it on the turntable, and I go, wait a minute, these lyrics are different than the Rolling Stones version. So I check the Godrich-Dixon discography and I find out, oh, this is take 2. So a very rare recording. I had these recordings, I kept them for decades. I actually bought 78s of many different genres. I remember in the early 70s I bought Julio Martinez Oyangaran recordings. He was a Uruguayan guitarist who played at the White House for Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1936. And he got a Philip Interdonati guitar as a gift. Interdonati was an Italian-American guitar maker in New York at the time. And so I got to buy mandolin records. I bought Japanese records eventually when I was learning Japanese, which I started in 2004. It was my 7th language, having studied 6 European languages before that. And so I was able to take those Japanese recordings of Kodo, and or I should say Sami-san, with singing. They were made circa 1905, and I got to bring them to the class at the end of the year party at the Santa Clara County Japanese Christian Church, where I had classes every other Thursday for an hour with my classmates. You know, Chris Palmer, who had taught chemistry at UC Berkeley decades beforehand, etc. One black guy who was a student at Carnegie Mellon, very smart guy, and a lot of great people that were motivated learning Japanese. And so I was able to share the recordings, not to play them, but to show the recordings that were already at that time a century old. And it was very fascinating collecting 78 RPM records. I started in March of 1968, and to be able to buy Lonnie Johnson records. There's a place called Jack's Records up in San Francisco, and he exclusively sold 78 RPM records. He's since passed away. He was gray-haired when I met him, and he was 40 years my senior, and it was really a delight to go to his store, park in the neighborhood, walk a couple blocks or whatever to go in and walk out with an armload of 1930s RCA or Decca recordings by various blues guys that I was interested in. And eventually I sold some of the great recordings that I bought in the 70s to buy instruments wholesale. In the late 80s, early 90s, I sold a lot of the recordings. I remember I sold the Robert Johnson record, I think, for $200, thinking, hey, I did real well. I've seen Robert Johnson recordings years ago even sell for $3,500 on eBay, which is not a bad price. But many of the early blues recordings that are extremely rare sell for $15,000 on auctions that we have currently on the internet. I remember back at the time I was buying these things, I was hanging out with a guy named Bill Thompson. He was about 20 years older than me and had kids that were my age, high school graduates, etc. And he had been collecting for about 20 years, and eventually I said, oh man, these record collectors, these guys are heavier than heart surgeons. Kind of stupid to say so, but I was very impressed as to people. I got to meet Bob Pinson, who became the Country Music Hall of Fame record librarian. I bought my first Jimmy Rogers record from him for $1. Back in those days, Blind Blake, great ragtime soloist for guitar who recorded in Chicago, his recordings would sell for $200, and that was in the days of when minimum wage was $2 an hour at that time. And I think you had Pegleg Howell and his gang, all sorts of great Gus Cannon jug stompers, and that stuff was pretty pricey compared to the recordings I was able to acquire. At Bill Thompson's house, about 4 blocks away from where I live with my parents in Sunnyvale, California, you could go over and hang out with him, and he'd play New Minglewood Blues, which was a hit on the very first Grateful Dead LP in 1968, I guess. And I got to meet Nick Pearls at Bill Thompson's house. Nick Pearls being the producer of Yazoo Records, one of the early American labels that would put 78 RPM records of blues as well as folk country things, make them available to people. And so I remember listening to New Minglewood Blues, the original Gus Cannon Jug Stompers version after the Grateful Dead LP came out. I grew up in a time where my classical guitar teacher, Byron Pang, who I studied with 1979 through 1981, he would go to see Presti and LaGoya concerts when I was seeing Jimi Hendrix. I saw Jimi Hendrix 5 times. I went to Monterey Pop Festival the weekend I graduated high school. My mom said, you've got to be on the stage to get your diploma on Friday night. You can go to the Pop Festival on Saturday and Sunday. And so my friends Rick Bruning and his brother Fritz, they were on their way to Ensenada to go surfing back in the days when it was safe to go just about anywhere in Mexico. And so in 1967 I went to Monterey Pop Festival. I saw Ravi Shankar. So I grew up in that period of time getting to see Jimi Hendrix. I tell you the greatest Jimi Hendrix story. This probably would date from 1968. I was at the Winterland concert. You had Jimi Hendrix, and he played Foxy Lady, and do a couple guitar solos, finish the song 8 minutes later. And then the crowd yelled, "Foxy Lady." He played it twice in a row, a very extraordinary thing. People like Miguel Yobey, Taraga student, he had that happen to him in concerts. Domingo Prat, when Domingo Prat went back to Catalunya and did concerts in 1930 when he was writing his Diccionario de Guitarristas y Guitarreros, a dictionary of guitarists and guitar makers in Spanish. When he was getting ready to finish having done all the research, he went back and played concerts. So I have those concerts in my book, Annotations for the History of the Classical Guitar in Argentina, 1822 to 2000. I did the translation of Catalan for those particular reviews of his performance, but it mentioned that he got asked to play the same song twice at the within the same set. And I think it was called the Emigrant Song, Canción de Emigrante. And but very fascinating to be able to buy 78 RPM records as a young adult, and hang out with the Candide people, getting to hear 78 RPM records that they had acquired. Another guy who I got to meet in Los Angeles at the same time, I hitchhiked to LA with my sleeping bag, and call Henry, said, "Yeah, come on over, man." And so I'd just sleep in the living room and then go on my way the next day after hanging out with Al Wilson and Henry. Remember Al Wilson? We listened to Terry Riley in C, and at the end, Al Wilson said, I think he ended on a C note. And I was like amazed. Now I just go, hey, it's pretty obvious. But I got to meet Barrett Hansen. Barry Hansen became Dr. Demento. I met him pre-demented. He shared a house in Topanga Canyon with Mark Andes, who was a bass player in the Spirit Band. And so I went over to Barrett's house, Barry Hansen. I had actually met him at a Spirit concert. We were both sitting in front of the stage at Winterland. I'd actually met him probably a year before then, but then I got to meet him personally at his house. And he had a huge record collection, just room after room full of 78s in shelves and well contained. And so I remember getting to hear various blues guys that I hadn't heard of before. Do Rollin' Blues by Garfield Akers, stuff like that. And so in the early days, you had to wait 6 weeks to find out. Now you have to wait 10 days at the most if there's an auction of 78 RPM records on eBay. Sometimes it's 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, 10 days. But back then you had to wait 6 weeks. I remember going, oh, if I win all these records, I don't even have enough money to pay my rent. Back in those days, I had a couple musicians that I shared a house with in Cambrian Park, and we used to pay $240 a month, $80 a piece, to rent a 3-bedroom house that now sells for $800,000 or $1 million. But that was 1971, 1972. Back in the days, I did a bunch of radio shows on KTOW Radio with Dr. Clayton. That was his name. He was a shrink for a day job, but he was a blues collector and aficionado, and so I would bring a bunch of 78 RPM records to play. I had the rarest stuff. And I had Lonnie Johnson's very first recording made in 1926. It was violin and guitar on one side, violin and piano on one side, guitar and piano on the other side, and very neat. Lonnie Johnson was a big influence on B.B. King. You kind of mix Django Reinhardt with Lonnie Johnson, you get B.B. King. More so Lonnie Johnson. And so I used to be thrilled to be able to get my hands on these recordings, and I'd sit with my guitar and learn the licks. Lightnin' Hopkins, 1948, early electric guitar things, and they were using the small amps and whatever pickups. A lot of the videos, I encourage you to look for some of these artists that I've mentioned on YouTube, because they've really become rather prominent. I think millions of people have watched Crossroads or listened to Crossroads by Robert Johnson. I found that out a few months ago. So I really, I ended up selling, I think about 1994, I ended up selling about 18 foot thick of 78 RPM records. I still got a bunch of my blues recordings to augment my income at the store. I would sell, maybe 15 years ago, Robert Nighthawk, great slide guitar. Look up Robert Nighthawk on YouTube. You will not be underwhelmed. He was the greatest electric slide guitar player in the 1950s, 60s, playing in Chicago, just bar none. So I sold a recording, I think, for $150 15 years ago on eBay, something like that, and just add that money, and it would eventually offer me more money to buy instruments wholesale from Spain. I started importing guitars in 1998 and imported 430 guitars from then up till 2017. Now I import 19th century guitars, 20th century guitars, very rare signed models, and I've added those to my collection that I've been able to offer my clientele. Several weeks ago I got a 1934 Santos Hernandez, not imported, but other instruments. I just got in a 1932 Enrique Sanfilio. I did a video of that the other day. That came in from Europe. And I got a Fortunato Piramali guitar. We did a video of that. We're going to have, Sebastian Quintero did a video of that a couple weeks ago. great sound. Very early cedar top, if not the oldest cedar top guitar made. It was a very exciting time for me in the early 60s, I should say late 60s, to start collecting 78 RPM records. I remember around the time in 1972, 73, when I was doing the radio shows, I would be listening to Vessel Osman and his trio play St. Louis Tickle, and that dated from like 1906. And so I really liked the fact that it would extend my life. Now I got 15 violins in stock from the 18th century. I've got lots of violins from the 19th century. I just sold a cello made in Mittenwald 200 years ago. Sold that about 4 months ago to a person that used to play in symphonies and then got into working in high tech, and then recently got a resurgence in her life to play cello again. So I really enjoy the instruments and the recordings. I was able to put a lot of the classical guitar, flamenco guitar on my Golden Era recordings that I sold from 1998 up to about 2013. Then YouTube took over to the extent that it really wasn't worth spending the thousands of dollars. I think I spent $9,000 on recordings from 2005 till about 2013, and I would copy them onto a hard disk recorder and then have Terence Farrell, great classical guitarist who used to play Princess Cruises 30 years ago. He lives down in Carmel, and I had him use Audition software to clean up the recordings of the 78s and some of the LPs that might have been in secondary quality condition. And I collected a lot of mandolin instruments. I collected mandolin recordings. I got mentioned in the Guitar in America hardbound book. At that time, the researcher, I forget his name, that published the book or wrote it, he documented that I had put out 4 CDs of mandolin orchestras and solos. I eventually had a total of 8 mandolin orchestras and solos, but all I do is run my violin and guitar shop now. I don't do all the small stuff I used to be involved in. And I think I'll end there for today.